When I was a kid, one of my most favorite games of all times was StarCraft. I can't say I was ever really good at it, but I enjoyed the aesthetics and the plot, and I absolutely loved the Zerg. While my friends and classmates were all about Lara Croft, I was secretly into Sarah Kerrigan. There are two main alien races in StarCraft, you know. Protoss are technologically advanced to the degree of being kinda fused with their energy crystals, robots, computers, AIs, you get it. Zerg, on the contrary, made a bet on biological improvement. All their buildings and units are organic, made of living tissue, kind of their own organisms working together as a hive. I'd say there is a good question built in world building here. I mean, what path are we humans gonna follow ourselves in the future, in our real world? Will we become more like Protoss or more like Zerg? There's actually a very similar dichotomy in anime Gargantia on the Verdurous Planet. Half of the local humanity used high-tech space mecha, while the other half had genetically engineered themselves into some, kaiju starfish squids or something. Given a choice to join one of these factions, I suppose the best option will be instantly obvious for most peoples, and it's not the organic biotech. I believe there might be several mechanisms at play here, one of them being aesthetics. I mean, there are instinctive reactions that we humans have evolved for self-preservation. We want to keep a safe distance from weirdly shaped large-sized animals or from something that looks like a naked meat with bones. Also, there's such thing as trypophobia, which probably evolved to avoid beehives and people with skin diseases. So, all in all, organic biotech just doesn't look as good to the human eye as do the smooth surfaces and cool angles of the robot AI technology. Then, many peoples have this fear of something alien or foreign invading their body. There are anti-vaxxers and homeopaths who build on it to the unscientific extremes, but the fear itself is fairly reasonable. We evolved it because we live in a world full of bacteria, viruses, and poisons. Then we have this cultural stigma of a monster, and I believe that very few peoples would voluntarily subscribe to look like a monster or to deal with a monster. We humans are not very tolerant to the different skin colors and eye shapes, and the fate of a monster is certainly not gonna be a happy one. Fortunately, the products of our real-life modern genetic engineering look nothing like Zerg or kaiju starfish squids or flashy gamepads on umbilical cords, but more on that later. First, and I should have probably started with that, let's have a brief look into how this real-life genetic engineering came to be and where it is now. Well, it sounds like a technology that has appeared just fairly recently. Genetic engineering is actually one of the most ancient technologies that humanity had unlocked. It is a matter of a debate what exactly do we count as genetic engineering, but at its broadest, this concept surely includes selective breeding, which we humans have been doing for as long as we had domesticated animals. There is some natural flow and change of genes that occurs because of how life adapts to the environment and to the other life around it. Least adapted genes go extinct, while most adapted multiply, mutate, and diversify. If you mess with this flow in any way, that kinda qualifies as genetic engineering. And while the ancient peoples knew nothing of the DNA, they grasped the concept that, for example, if you made two human-friendly wolves, you might get yourself a whole bunch of cute human-friendly puppies. And if you plant seeds from the biggest watermelons, you might grow yourself a bunch of maybe even bigger ones. Thus, the genes of being the most adapted for the domesticated species were no longer those that helped them endure the wilderness, but rather genes that made them more useful for humans. That method of breeding the best animals and plants, while simple and effective, has one obvious limitation. You can only select between the traits that are already there, plus occasional mutations, but you can't really add something yourself, even if you try very hard. What these ancient peoples lacked was a solid theoretical base, and that only came in the middle of the 19th century in the shape of works of Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel. None of these respectable gentlemen were aware of the existence of DNA, but they both described the way it works quite well. It took one more century to finally discover the molecule and figure out its exact structure and function, and once we finally knew what we dealt with, we started to experiment with it. So, what is DNA? Well, it's a very long and complex organic molecule, which does not have a fixed structure, but rather a pattern of organization. It is made of separate units, 4 different types of nucleotides, which each consist of a sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base, and those nucleotides tend to stick in pairs. If you stack a lot of them in a line, you get a kind of a simple code, like binary but with 4 symbols. Some cell structures are adapted to read that code and either produce proteins or change some cell settings. Proteins are basically the machinery of the cell. They define how all works, and thus the DNA defines the cell around itself. If we rewrite the DNA, it will work differently and produce different cells, which will make up a different organism. So, as soon as DNA got discovered, peoples started doing just that, but at first their methods were primitive and rough. Actually, peoples have been doing this a couple of decades before DNA. Since the discovery of radioactivity, scientists have tested it on all kinds of subjects, living things included. When the structure and function of DNA got known, it was finally possible to explain the mechanism of what was going on. Radioactive particles damage the DNA strands, which can get fixed incorrectly, which is called mutation. Most of these mutations are bad, since they unpredictably mess with the blueprint from which organism constantly rebuilds itself. They often end in cell death or cancer. With a very low probability, however, you might get a mutation that's really good and useful, but this probability is really low, and even if you hit it, there are very high chances that the rest of your DNA will irreparably mutate to the dark side. I mean, irradiating living organisms to get a good mutation is like throwing wrenches and screwdrivers into an open car engine with the hope that one of them will miraculously improve the machine. Unlike in the case of selective breeding, you can actually introduce something new to the genome this way if you try hard. Chances for that are non-zero, but kinda non-acceptably low if we speak about animals. It is, however, easily applicable to plants. If you've got a ton of grain, you can irradiate millions of organisms at once and get a real chance to win that low-chance good mutation lottery. A lot of plant species that are cultivated nowadays are actually the descendants of mutants produced with this technique, called mutation breeding. It got employed in special facilities called atomic gardens, which were basically large-scale experiments of radiation influence on plant life. Besides radiation, mutation breeding might also involve chemicals, and I believe this exact approach is what inspired most of modern movie mutants and a lot of superheroes. In reality, such a technique would only be effective in egg cells or seeds, not in grown-up organisms. Grown-up organisms would just get cancer, and even if there will be a good mutation in one of the cells, it has no way to spread around the organism. In reality, mutation breeding is used almost exclusively on plants, and no known examples of Hulk, Flash, Captain America or Superpower spiders have been created so far. Situation is slightly better with X-Men and other mutants, but just slightly. There cannot be a single X gene that could express itself in so many different variations. All the mutants must kinda be each his own species, and most of the abilities that they demonstrate are either incompatible with human anatomy or just plain impossible in principle. Slightly more realistic are the organic-type mutants that have body alterations and enhanced physical traits. I'd say the hardest of the X-Men might be either Wolverine or the Beast, but even they will rank as mediocre sci-fi at best. I mean, while the mutations are not impossible, there must be a lot of them. It's not a change in a single gene, but rather a major rewriting of a genome, which would require near impossible amount of luck to mutate all at once at random. Mutation breeding peaked from 1950s to 1970s, and then some more precise tools appeared. Bioscience peoples figured that some proteins might be used like a sort of molecular scissors, and soon they learned to cut and paste the genes. That got known as recombinant DNA technology. For the first time in history, gene exchange between species was happening under a sapient supervision. Horizontal gene transfer actually sometimes happens in the nature on its own. Under certain conditions, genes can hop between species. A huge chunk of our own genome is actually remains of the genomes of the viruses that our species had to suffer in the remote past. So, in 1970s and 1980s, scientific peoples produced first of the so-called GMO, genetically modified organisms. Those were mostly crops, resistant to some pesticides or herbicides, as well as there were also lab-test mice, which suffered from gene knockoff experiments, from which scientists got to really know which gene does what. While mutation breeding was met with mixed but generally optimistic reaction, the targeted molecular genetic engineering technology got persecuted right from the start. Peoples suddenly demonstrated intense hostility towards improved crops, but that didn't stop the progress. The next big breakthrough happened in 2012 when Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier published a paper about some weird sequences in bacterial DNA known as clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, or CRISPR for short. It was actually discovered by some Japanese scientists in 1987, but its function got determined only 2 decades later. CRISPR turned out to be a versatile tool that kinda works as a molecular version of immune system for bacteria. It is capable to identify and cut out virus genome sequences that are trying to infect bacterial DNA. CRISPR's ability to recognize specific DNA sequences and make cuts at necessary places proved out to be that magic wand that genetic engineers have been looking for so long. It turned out you can really do a lot with it. If mutation breeding is like throwing wrenches into the engine and recombinant DNA is like really tinkering with an engine with a wrench, CRISPR is more like Mr. Manhattan-style engineering, or at least something really close to that. Targeted genetic engineering brought us innumerable profits. We have pure, widely available insulin thanks to that, plus many vaccines, as well as treatments for cancer and inherited diseases. We have drought-resistant, overproductive, vitamin-rich crops. We have lab-grown meats and biofuels, and we will soon have much, much more. There is a movie that builds on the subject, named Splice, and it's kinda hard to put it on my sci-fi harness tier list. On the bright side, the genetic engineering tech that the movie demonstrates us is at least partially very real. According to the plot of the movie, a couple of bioscientists have created a new life form, using DNA raided from the genomes of dozens of different, very loosely related species. That is not impossible at all, since the genetic code in all us, from humans to bacteria, works on the same principle and has a lot of data overlapping across the species. If carefully selected to work in tandem, genes of the different species can coexist just fine, and can produce something entirely new and unseen. They cannot, however, produce some new unique protein, which is what the new species in the movie do. To produce this protein, you should have a gene for it, and the gene should be somewhere in your CRISPR toolbox already. It gets worse when the plot proceeds to the main dish. Movie bioscientists decide to add human cells into the mix and grow an organism that will somehow help us treat aging and cancer and stuff? I am sorry, but that is not how genetic science helps peoples. We don't need to grow an adult organism. Most things can be tested on human cell cultures, in petri dishes. We have lab mice if we need to test something organism level, and there is absolutely no need to grow horror hybrids. Hybrid can unexpectedly change its sex, which is actually known from many species in nature and is totally possible. However, hybrid also has a lot of other features that do not look like hard science at all. It ages impossibly fast for a vertebrate life form and has Lego genetics issue. That's when poorly educated scriptwriters think that you can take some elephant genes and make any organism grow a trunk. That is not how genes work. Genes are an orchestra, and trunk is just a part of a melody they play together. You can't just transfer traits. You have to change the entire orchestral bit and rewrite the whole symphony for it to fit a new body plan. You definitely can't get a complex, specialized and properly functioning body part by accident. It has to either naturally evolve or be carefully designed. The most non-scientific thing about Splice, however, is the behavior of local scientists. For peoples with such a profound understanding of genetic sciences, they are surprisingly incompetent. They consistently make stupid and risky decisions, and sometimes they act downright insane. I get it that it was necessary to move plot forward, and I get it that extra parts on the mutant mean more fun for the audience, but the best I can say about sci-fi hardness of Splice is aluminum tier, mediocre science fiction. However, mixing genomes of different species is not the limit, and CRISPR was not even the final stage of genetic engineering tech evolution so far. The next generation revolution is happening around here and now, and it's caused by AI. If properly educated, AIs are capable to predict the exact shapes of protein molecules that we need and that do not exist in nature. These proteins will get made out of the same amino acids as all the other proteins, it's just that their final folding shape will be unique. So, if CRISPR lets us manipulate the parts of the engine freely, AI will allow us to do that one thing that genetic engineers dreamed about since the dawn of selective breeding: to create entirely new parts, new desired traits. Sadly, many people still are being Luddite about genetic engineering and treat it as if it was some invasive alien life form. Remember those peoples who were unhappy with GMO crops? Well, over the years they have multiplied and diversified. Various prejudices and conspiracy theories arose, which I could probably broadly split into 4 main groups. The first group are healthcare-type GMO haters, which state that in one way or another, use of genetically modified foods harms our organism. Hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, however, show that use of GMOs is no more dangerous than eating regular foods, and there is absolutely no reason for them to be. At the end of the day, their DNA is made out of the same nucleotides as ours, and their proteins are made of the same amino acids. DNA of an organism we eat, be it wild, domestic, or GMO, goes through the ringer of our gut and does not influence us in any other way except nutritional. GMOs can cause allergies, of course, but so can regular foods, and to be fair, GMOs are tested with much more scrutiny. The second group are eco-doomsday preppers, which propose different scenarios of how GMO can cause ecological apocalypse. These might be actually up to something. I mean, if we make an organism with some unfair advantage against the naturally evolved environment, it can easily become invasive, or cause some extreme resistance evolution in pests, or cause some food chain cascade collapse. Yeah, but that just kinda means we should use it cautiously. I mean, fire can destroy cities, but that never really stopped us from using it. We just had to find a way to control it. Third faction are corporate political conspiracists, which usually have some twisted story either about how a big company fucked up the life of a small man, or about how government is secretly plotting something very evil. While there are known legal incidents, they often turn out to be about a small man stealing genetically advanced crops from a big company. In general, even if an argument of a corporate political conspiracist points out something real, like crop patenting or lobbying problems, it is usually an issue of current judicial system, not the GMOs themselves. The law is slow, but such is the law, and sooner or later it will catch up with reality. Fourth group are ethical and religious skeptics. As a matter of fact, in most religions, creation of the new life forms is in the God's domain, so it's only logical for the believing peoples to be pissed. The scientific reality of the situation, however, is that all life forms, humans included, are just very complex organic robots, which have their core structure coded in a readable and editable format. There is no sacred seal on that, just some technical limitations, and once we will be able to overcome them, we probably will. I have recently read an article about transgender peoples in USSR, and I must say, oh boy, a harsh life they had. While Stalin was alive, just for raising the topic you could have easily got either shot to death or thrown to rot in a concentration camp, or both. After the demented dictator was gone, Soviet psychiatrists gradually learned to accept the idea that some peoples might want to change their gender and that these peoples are otherwise absolutely mentally okay, not a single sign of schizophrenia. There were some bureaucratic challenges to the issue as well, and not many surgeons were ready to try to do the thing. One of them described a profound feeling of some limits that should not be crossed when you deal with living beings. Nowadays, gender-affirming surgery is an everyday reality in many clinics all around the world, and there are lots of people who pay their bills by crossing these limits every day at work, all while helping other people to live the life they want. And while there is still a lot of controversy around the topic, it is generally accepted by public in democratic countries. I believe that genetic engineering will gradually go through a similar cultural and structural transformation in the decades to come. For now, most peoples stand against even curing the diseases with genetic engineering. One Chinese guy did that and faced a very harsh reaction from both the scientific community and the Chinese government. He attempted to make 2 newborn girls immune to HIV, but didn't go an extra mile with the transparency of the experiments and didn't get a proper consent from parents, as well as lots of medical people disapproved of his choice of disease. And I can see why. It would be a way better idea to begin with treating some genetic disease, not granting resistance to a more or less manageable virus. As a result, that guy, Jiankui, spent 3 years in prison, and now he is banned from science for life and is generally disrespected by everyone. A lot of governments tightened their human genetic engineering regulations, and the progress in the field became significantly slower. It's a shame though, since what he did was nowhere near as bad as those scientists from Splice. If all the formalities would have been met, this experiment could have been a great success that improved 2 human lives and laid a groundwork for future advancements. In his defense, I have a slight suspicion that if Jiankui followed all the laws and regulations, he would have never been allowed to do anything. So he probably decided that it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, but neither of them he was granted. One day, the fog will settle, however, and there will be first successful experiments with children healed from ancient family curses, with all the necessary paperwork and stuff, and then, sooner or later, we will inevitably move to the next step – human improvement. This one is much more controversial than genetic healing right from the start. Many will see it as unfair if some chosen ones will get some advantageous bonus traits, like enhanced intellect or strength, and it won't be just courts and hospitals that disapprove. There probably will be some serious protest activity coming from the common folks, like against the GMO, but worse. A version of such a future is shown in a movie Gattaca. Here, you are for a fact born inferior if you were not genetically predesigned. Gattaca, however, gets it wrong. We living beings are not just our genes, we are also a result of environmental influence, on which I spoke in more detail in my video on clones, but in short, for now, a child with perfect athlete genes can grow into a sickly weakling if he doesn't get enough nutrition and exercise, and a kid with mediocre genes can make it to the Olympics if he trains a lot and in a proper way. Genes make up only half of the human equation at best, and the other, nurture half, is not that easy to measure and analyze. So I do not think genes will be used for some sort of social ranking. DNA, however, can and will get used for identification, and it is actually happening here and now, but mostly in forensics so far. DNA is the most precise and reliable way to identify a specific human being, and I don't think we will find any other better approach even in the remote future. What will probably change is how fast we can process it. For now, identifying a human through DNA demands a small laboratory with a crew of trained personnel and some special equipment that costs a lot of money and takes a lot of place. And the whole process takes days to weeks. But the same could have been said about dactyloscopy once. And I mean, we still need specialized forensic dactyloscopists, sure, but now most modern phones can read fingerprints in like a blink of an eye. While it is not gonna happen anytime soon, I presume someday door locks and money terminals might demand our DNA in the same way. Back to Gattaca, however, one thing where movie seriously missteps is when it does astronaut screening by genome. I mean, it is of course an important and useful thing to do, but there should be regular medical checks as well, and the heart disease that the main hero has should not have gone unnoticed. He doesn't really show much symptoms, and it is unclear whether he actually has any or just got a genetic predisposition towards heart diseases, and if so, if he is physically healthy, I do not see any problem with sending that goddamn man into space. I mean, it's not a breeding program, it's his health that matters, not his genes. Gattaca also shows us a man with perfect genes who got paralyzed after an accident. It is true that there are spinal injuries from which you can never recover, but if the improved genes do not aid with neural regeneration, they are kinda not that helpful. I mean, if he suddenly broke his spine in an accident during space exploration, of what use his improved genes would be then? And if none, why use them for screening? I have a slight suspicion that by the time we get to the DNA logs, we will also learn to enhance neural regeneration. I'd put that as number one priority on my human gene improvement list. Anyway, even despite a layer of Z rust and all my nitpicks, Gattaca is generally still more or less hard science fiction. I'd rate it as tungsten tier. Jude Law, by the way, also happened to be in another notable genetic engineering movie, the eXistenZ, and I must honestly admit that I am heavily biased towards this one. It was, and still is, one of my most favorite sci-fi movies. It influenced me a lot when I was younger, and to this day I sometimes dream of this ability. Like scream, "eXistenZ on pause!" and put the entire reality on a standby for a while. The tech that movie shows us is curious to say the least. I haven't seen stuff like that anywhere before or after the eXistenZ. It must be Cronenberg's dark genius. The gamepads are made out of flesh here. They have their own circulatory and neural systems and connect to you directly. You do not just watch the game and press the buttons. You are inside the game, like in your mind. This might be actually really possible, but with several buts. While it is certainly possible to establish such biotech-brain connection, it would take some time for a human to learn to operate it, as well as the optimal place for a socket would not be on the waist. I'd try something closer to the brain, like nasal cavities or titan weak spot. The fact that movie seems to ignore completely is that infections and immune system exist. I mean, if you have a hole connecting your spinal canal to the environment, it is just a matter of time for you to get meningitis and/or encephalitis. And if you stick some foreign organic piece into this hole, it will surely deeply upset your neutrophils, lymphocytes, and macrophages. I suppose that can be solved if you genetically engineer gamepads to personally feed every customer and then implant them into bodies permanently, but that is not what we are shown in the movie. I think Tooth Gun is very plausible though. I mean, if we master the CRISPR tech, we can grow fishes and amphibians with any bone shapes that we need, and why not make them assemble into a gun? There are not that many biological substances that can replace gunpowder, but otherwise Tooth Gun is quite hardcore. Sadly, I can't say that about the rest of the local biotech, and in total it would rank iron and glass tier at best. The other gaming system we are shown in the movie is actually a much more plausible technology. I have discussed brain-to-machine interface issues in my video about psychics, but for now, in short, if we count this tech towards the overall eXistenZ science fiction hardness rating, the average might reach at the very least firm sci-fi, quartz tier. There actually was one more cool sci-fi biotech movie with Jude Law, called Repo Man, but it's not exactly about genetic engineering, and I will leave it for some other time. Genetic engineering in general is a topic too broad for just one video, which is long enough already, and I haven't even begun speaking on the de-extinction possibilities, though I touched it a bit in my dinosaur video. As well as genetic engineering might be our get-out-of-jail-free card against the climate change, and there are many other things it can do. Also, if you've been with this channel for a while, you might have noticed that I had two pet gerbils that helped me make these videos, Jojo and Mushi. While I was making this video, Jojo got sick, and despite the best efforts of veterinarians, there is now only Mushi left. So, rest in peace, my old little friend, and thanks for all the good times we had together. I am an atheist, but if some form of afterlife unexpectedly exists, I hope you are now in a good place.